Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of the Atlanta Opera's BlinkOpera podcast. I'm conductor and creator Timothy Myers. I made my debut at the Atlanta Opera in 2018, conducting Sweeney Todd, and am thrilled to be back leading Puccini's breathtaking classic, Madama Butterfly. I grew up in central Kansas, far from a symphony orchestra or an opera house. I studied piano and some other instruments growing up. My exposure to classical music was largely through public radio. I think the first time I heard an orchestra play live, I was around 14, and though I had seen many operas on video, my first live experience was at 21 years of age. Fast forward to some years later, and I've had the great fortune of conducting at leading opera houses and symphony orchestras throughout the globe. Puccini came to the story of Madame Butterfly when he was in London and saw a play by David Belasco titled Madame Butterfly, A Tragedy of Japan, which was based on a short story by John Luther Long. There are various ideas on the genesis of Long's piece, but it appears to be based on a number of sources, including stories told to him by his sister, who had actually lived in Nagasaki for a time as a missionary, and a semi-autobiographical novel by Pierre Loti, a French naval officer and author known for his exotic novels and short stories. It seems as though fact and fiction were merged to create the source material for Madama Butterfly. Of course, as a dramatist at heart, Puccini and his librettists adapted the play to function as a highly impactful piece of musical theater. Historically, we have to remember that in Puccini's time, the world was not nearly as connected as we are today. People used popular entertainment to transport them to an unknown or lesser-known place. Now, there is evidence that Puccini heard tunes from a music box that, oddly, was actually a Swiss music box playing Chinese folk tunes, but that this informed some of the melodies not only in Madame Butterfly, but in Turandot, his last opera, written a little over 20 years after Madama Butterfly. We also know from some of his correspondence that Puccini did research far beyond this and went to great pains to portray what he considered a realistic musical atmosphere. Now keep in mind that this period in opera is known as the Verismo, or realism period, which was a period in which composers like Puccini were moving distinctly away from portraying gods, kings and queens, mythology, etc., to a more realistic and contemporary vernacular, portraying characters with whom the audience could more easily relate. We know that Puccini established a relationship with the wife of the Japanese ambassador to Rome, Mrs. Oyama, who was his main informant in Italy as he was doing research for this piece. In fact, in a letter to his publisher, Puccini wrote that in addition to teaching him about music from Japan, that Mrs. Oyama confirmed that she knew a story roughly like that of Butterfly that really happened. Mrs. Oyama sang to him some Japanese folk songs, and he was also, through various other methods, able to acquire more source material shipped from Tokyo. One scholar has written that there are at least 10 authentic melodies identifiable in the score. And in fact, the wedding of Pinkerton and Chocho-san is accompanied by strains of the Japanese national anthem, Kimi ga Yo. This is a bit of a crazy personal story, but believe it or not, the first time I conducted Butterfly, I had 24 hours to prepare before I led an orchestra dress rehearsal. You know, sometimes as a young conductor, you have very unexpected opportunities. So when I got the call, I stayed up all night learning the score as best as I could. 24 hours later, I was conducting an orchestra dress rehearsal. Fortunately, the next time, I had several months' notice and was able to really learn the score in a less hurried and a much more in-depth way. Almost 20 years and many performances of Butterfly later, after that first outing, I'm still continually discovering new things in the piece. Of course, that's the mark of a masterpiece. Madama Butterfly opens with a flurry of activity. The fugal orchestral opening is often thought to illustrate the frenzied activity of a New York street. We then transition quickly to Nagasaki, where we find wedding preparations underway. Pinkerton and Butterfly meet for the first time, and there's a wedding ceremony that, as you'll see, as anything that involves family, doesn't go completely swimmingly. When Butterfly and Pinkerton are finally alone, they sing a sprawling, ravishingly beautiful duet to end Act 1. I love this duet. We witness them growing from two human beings of vastly different cultures who just met, which is indicated by them singing to each other, but mostly separately, into a climax where at last their voices join together in soaring melody, powerfully underscored by the orchestra. As Act 2 begins, we rejoin Butterfly and her maid Suzuki. Except, not all is well. Pinkerton has now been gone for 3 years. Despite the warnings of many around her, Butterfly remains defiantly steadfast in her belief in Pinkerton's promise to return. We've also added another character, Dolore, or Sorrow, a 2-year-old boy conceived by Butterfly after her wedding to Pinkerton, a constant reminder of her American husband. She sings the well-known aria Un bel dì, or One Fine Day, extolling how Pinkerton will indeed return, come up the hill, and speak the names he used to call her: little one, dear wife, orange blossom, and then all will be well. After a second act that is a true emotional roller coaster, Pinkerton's ship has been spotted entering the harbor. An elated Butterfly proudly announces how everyone was wrong about him not returning, and she instructs the house to be filled with flower blossoms as she dons the same dress she wore as a bride. As Butterfly, Suzuki, and the young Dolore wait for Pinkerton's arrival, night falls, and we hear an invisible, wordless chorus that lulls both Suzuki and Dolore to sleep, while Butterfly keeps her vigil, waiting for her love. The humming chorus, as it's known, transitions into an orchestral interlude that brings forth the day, though we have a sinking feeling that day might not be as beautiful as Butterfly dreamed. Thank you all for joining me on the Atlanta Opera podcast, BlinkOpera. I'm Timothy Myers, conductor of Madama Butterfly, and I'm excited for you to experience this gripping production and world-class cast. If you've enjoyed learning more about this timeless masterpiece, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way for more people like you to find out about our content. And don't forget to follow the Atlanta Opera Podcast for more great episodes. Lastly, if you're interested in knowing more about my work, you can also check out my podcast called Listening on Purpose, which is available at timothymyers.com or wherever else you like to listen. Thanks for being with us today.